Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in the next minute. I'm just going to remind everyone to please mute their microphones so that we don't have any background noise as our speakers give their presentations. If you forget to mute your microphone, I will mute it for you, so don't be surprised if it suddenly turns off. You are welcome to keep your camera on. We will have a little bit of interactive conversation during the session today, but it's perfectly fine if you want to keep your camera off too. Welcome again. This is our Team Research Forum, formerly known as the COVID-19 Research Town Hall. We're very excited about this new format and the new content that we're going to bring to you in addition to relevant developments on COVID-19 research across campus. I'm going to let Associate Vice Chancellor Paul Dodd go ahead and start the session, and just thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Ana Lucia, and thanks to you and Marjani and colleagues for helping organize this. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Paul Dodd. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for Interdisciplinary Research and Strategic Research Initiatives. So that mouthful means that we try and encourage and support a lot of team-based research activity across campus. As Ana Lucia mentioned, we have pivoted to take some of the learnings that we made over the last year in how to put together teams of researchers rapidly to address COVID-19 related challenges. And we're trying to figure out, what are key topics that need to be addressed in team research and team science that we should provide a forum for. So that's really what we're trying to do in this forum. Now, over the summer months, one of the topics that we are hoping to run a series of these events on is around the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion in team research. So first of all, I guess to recap, there are many words for it, but over the last probably 30 or 40 years, academic research or higher education-based research has really changed quite considerably. The old mode of working predominantly as individual scholars in isolation has really been surpassed by team research-based activities. Part of this is by necessity, and part of this is just through literally, learning that we can tackle more complex problems by bringing people together from different backgrounds. Now, when I say backgrounds, typically that really focuses on topical backgrounds. So interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, there's differences in those words, but they kind of come down to the same thing, as you bring people together that have different understandings and different approaches, different methodologies. So that's sort of fairly well established. So down the bottom you'll see a number of logos that kind of refer to that this whole issue of team science or team research more broadly. It's not a STEM only related activity, of course. And there is, you see a logo there, Insight. So there is an international organization and conference around the science of team science. We have been involved in supporting a number of new team-based research activities in startup mode, as it were, here at Davis over the last decade or so. We ran a program called RISE, for example, Research Investment Science and Engineering, another one focused on social science and humanities. Called IFHA, and then more recently we've established these impact research centers that try and focus on, as the name suggests, how can you accelerate impact from research? And all of these things bring people from different backgrounds together. So without going into a huge amount of detail, there are various types of team-based research and team-based science approaches that span from multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches to convergence. Convergence is sort of a newer term really, and it sort of focuses in on very highly interdigitated interdisciplinary research where people really have to kind of develop an entirely new discipline effectively to tackle the problems that they're trying to address. But a lot of that is really the what. So what is team-based research? We've touched on that. The why do you want to have diverse teams work together, I think, is also actually pretty well established. So there have been many different, both academic articles and more, articles in the broader general press that diverse teams just outperform less diverse teams in almost every dimension. So, you know, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, really, given all that we know about bringing multi and interdisciplinary teams together, that when you bring people together from different backgrounds, from different, you know, socioeconomic backgrounds, from different ethnic backgrounds, just people from different, that have different life experiences, different viewpoints, and have people work in teams, you get more effective teams, because different people have different viewpoints and different expertise to bring to the table. So I think that that's pretty well accepted. But the question is, how do you do that? And, you know, there has been a lot more focus on other aspects of team research, and what we're hoping to investigate here today with our colleagues from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and from the Feminist Research Institute is a little bit more on the tactics and the approaches, the how, in other words. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand it back to Marjani. So thanks again, everyone, for being here, and I look forward to some discussion on this a little later on.
Thank you, Paul. That was very wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Marjani Akindunde. I work in the unit with Paul and Ana Lucia and Whitney. And we have a great, exciting presentation next. Michael Villalobos from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion will give us a great presentation on implementing the UC Davis Diversity Inclusion Strategic Vision. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Marjorie. And let me go ahead and just toggle a little bit to share my screen with you. And just give me a quick thumbs up, anyone who has a visual, to make sure that it looks okay. Thank you so much. Thanks, Marjorie. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of your forum today. Again, my name is Michael Villalobos, and I am with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I've been invited just to introduce the Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Vision to all of you. As Paul mentioned earlier, it's important for every member of the campus community to explore in terms of our participation in supporting a diverse campus community. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to explore how we may take part in the implementation of the Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Vision. I am assuming that for many of you, this will probably be the very first time that you are introduced to the Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Vision. And I want to make sure that as I present this information to you, it provides for an opportunity for you to go to your respective units, departments, to engage your colleagues in terms of what you are doing per the call to implement the strategic vision. After all, it is part of Chancellor May's To Boldly Go vision. And in the last year and a half, especially, I've been engaged with many units and departments, administrative and academic departments alike, in supporting and how they may implement the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. So if I may, just let me go back and toggle again, apologies. Oh boy. Is that better in terms of, okay, fantastic, apologies.
Yeah, that's perfect now, Mike.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for letting me know. So here is my planned flow for our time together today. I'll frame our conversation because I don't want to assume that we all have the same vantage point in terms of what it means for us to understand or to engage in conversation about equity and inclusion. And I'd like just to provide some concepts that would support our understanding as far as what it means to use those concepts as lenses in how we would implement the strategic vision. And then at the end, I'll have an opportunity to share in terms of possible next steps for each and every single one of you, and certainly be a resource to you moving forward. So let me just open up with this concept, this model, if I may. I am a diversity inclusion educator by training. My research interest looks at access issues, and in particular in higher ed. That explores retention programs for traditionally underrepresented students in four-year higher ed settings. So when I typically introduce this concept, it really follows student affairs work. And the way that I would frame diversity consciousness is understanding and awareness. So that is awareness and knowledge building that hopefully will inform skill development in the area of diversity, how we navigate and negotiate the reality of diversity, irrespective of what field you are in. I think it's important for us to consider this because after all, you work with people who are different from you, and every interaction that you have with someone is a cross-cultural experience. So why is it important for us to develop diversity consciousness? So there are competencies certainly related to this, and every single one of us have the opportunity to develop this because no one will be perfect. So when we think about the competencies related to diversity consciousness, it's in the area of communication, conflict management, empathy, self-evaluation, and leadership. So in communication, it's the different ways that we communicate. In conflict management, understanding that who we are by virtue of being cultural beings, and we are all walking, talking products of our experiences, and that's our default. It's also important to explore the different modes of conflict available for us to consider, because not all conflicts are the same. And empathy is an important skill and competency as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it really asks us to engage in perspective taking. If our default is who we are as cultural beings in terms of our immediate experiences, what does it mean for us to have a stance of making sure that we have a good understanding of how other folks who are different from us may experience in different spaces? And then in self-evaluation, how comfortable are you in negotiating cultural differences based on race, based on sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, religion? All of these things are important for us to consider because we actually are in different stages as far as awareness and knowledge and how that translates to skill development. And last but not least, I'm a firm believer that you do not have to have a formal leadership position to be a leader in this regard. And I think it's important for each and every single one of us, given your sphere of influence, to ask how you contribute in creating inclusive environments. So what does that look like? And what structures do you have in your respective departments that really promote an atmosphere that learn about different topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So I want to give each and every single one of you an opportunity to actually share in terms of your thoughts about this, because what I find is we actually do not have lots of opportunities to explore how we have engaged about diversity, equity, and inclusion within our respective units and departments, and also especially as part of what this would look like in action. So I'm going to ask Marjani to help me here and break you into smaller groups, and probably 5% per group, just to engage each other in conversation by responding to these reflection questions. In what ways have I promoted diversity and inclusion in my role as a leader? Again, formal and informal. How have you integrated diversity and inclusion that supports your department, your organization's mission? And as leaders, are diversity and inclusion standing agenda items in your group conversation? And when do you, as leaders of the organization, typically discuss issues related to diversity and inclusion? I think these are important prompts and reflection for all of us to engage in, and certainly sets us up in terms of, okay, what do I do with this information and how does it help in my understanding in terms of how I play a role in the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision? Okay, so if you have an opportunity to just, review these questions, take them with you in your small groups. We'll give you probably about, it's going to be very quick, probably 6 minutes. We'll do our best to give you a 2-minute warning and then come back, and then I'll proceed with the rest of my presentation. So look for the invitation from Marjani to be in your small groups.
I'm sending the breakout room invites, and we'll see you back here in 6 minutes. Wow, everybody's doing such a great job. This is like going perfect. Thank you.
Looks like there's at least 4 to 5 in every room. Room 20 has 1 person.
Oh, thank you, Whitney.
Okay, if you're still here and you haven't moved to a room, I'm gonna start moving you into rooms. This is your last chance to voluntarily move to a room.
Hey, it's Sarah Messbauer.
Hi.
I'm just listening in. So, and I joined by phone, so I can't move myself into a room.
Oh, okay.
Marjorie, just to check, my hard stop is 11:10, correct?
You started at 10:46, I saw. You said 7 minutes?
I'm sorry, the
Oh,
hard stop in my press. Yeah,
I was thinking about
Yeah.
the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Yes.
it's at 11:10.
Yes, correct. Mhm.
Okay, and then probably give them a 1-minute warning at 10:50.
10:50.
Yeah.
That's like in a minute.
Oh, yeah. I think they went. Did they go at 10:44? 10:46. I'm sorry.
I thought it was 10:46.
Oh, perfect. Then do 10:51.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So they're back at 10:52.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to share your files.
I connected I gave access to Box, and I'm trying to put them in the Box folder right now.
Oh, okay. I have never done this before, so I've never shared a file directly. So
If there's links, I can also just pop the link in.
I don't have the links. I'm sorry.
that's okay.
I mean, yeah. Typically, I'm able to attach them as in chat, but for some reason, it's not allowing me to do that. So.
That's something for us to check. You know, you always learn on something new. This is the first time someone asked us to do that, so now we know. We have to figure it out.
Cheryl just says they can't hear her in her breakout room.
I think it's because she called in on her phone, not on the app. So there's nothing we can do about that, unfortunately.
Okay, it's 10:52. So I'll go ahead and close. I sent a broadcast warning message.
You want me to just close all the rooms?
Sure, I could close it. So
Okay.
I have links to the files. I'll put them in the chat as soon as folks get back in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney.
This went really well. I'm always afraid of breakout rooms.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back, everyone. As you join back in the main room, just remember to keep your microphones muted.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good conversation. I know that was a quick one. I mean, my intention in engaging in that conversation is because, one, I know that many of you are already engaged in this work, and to give voice in terms of what that looks like. And for many of you, perhaps in listening to your colleagues, it provides an idea in terms of what it means to do this work, and potentially explore in terms of how you may consider what your colleagues have shared with you in support of the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. So let me just frame the next parts of my presentation in terms of why it's important for us to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in support of the principles of community. I imagine that most, if not all of you, are already familiar with the principles of community, but there's a challenge with the principles. They are not policies, but I think it's important for us to think about how we may operationalize its tenets, because implementing the diversity and inclusion strategic vision is very much aligned in terms of how we operationalize the tenets of the principle. So just a reintroduction, and maybe for some of you, this will be the very first time that you are being introduced to the principles of community. So here is a very short video, and then I'll continue with our conversation after the video. So here we go, and just click a thumbs up just to let me know if audio and video are okay.
The University of California, Davis is first and foremost an institution of learning,
teaching, research, and public service.
UC Davis reflects and is committed to serving the needs of a global society comprising all people
and a multiplicity of identities.
The university expects that every member of our community acknowledge, value,
and practice the following guiding principles.
We affirm the dignity inherent in all of us, and we strive to maintain a
climate of equity and justice demonstrated by respect for one another.
We acknowledge that our society carries within it
historical and deep-rooted injustices and biases.
Therefore, we endeavor to foster mutual understanding and respect among the many parts of our whole.
We affirm the right of freedom of expression within our community.
We affirm our commitment to nonviolent exchange
and the highest standards of conduct and decency towards all.
Within this context, we reject violence in all forms.
We promote open expression of our individuality
and our diversity within the bounds of courtesy, sensitivity, and respect.
We further recognize the right of every individual to think, speak, express,
and debate any idea limited only by university regulations governing time, place, and manner.
We confront and reject all manifestations of discrimination,
including those based on race, ethnicity, gender and gender expression, age, visible and non-visible disability, nationality,
sexual orientation,
citizenship status,
veteran status,
religious, non-religious, spiritual, or political beliefs,
socioeconomic class,
status within or outside the university,
or any of the other differences among people
which have been excuses for
misunderstanding,
dissension, or hatred.
We recognize and cherish the richness contributed to our lives by our diversity.
We take pride in all our achievements and we celebrate our differences.
We recognize that each of us has an obligation to the UC Davis community of which we have chosen to be a part.
We will strive to build and maintain a culture and climate based on
mutual respect and caring.
Okay, thank you. So let me just give a little bit of background on the Principles of Community. It was first drafted in 1990. It is something that is dear to me because, and I'm going to age myself here, I was one of the undergrads that participated in the initial drafting of the Principles of Community. We can all be proud that UC Davis led really the charge and all of our other sister campuses to draft their own Principles of Community. And been reaffirmed every 5 years. Last reaffirmation was in 2020. And as I said earlier, the challenge with the principles is that they are not policies. It's an aspirational message. So it really challenges each and every single one of us to explore in terms of how we operationalize its tenets. And the way that I work with groups is to think about this within the many parts of the work that they're engaged in these particular areas, from your statements and documents to program practices and procedures, to policies and practices related to personnel. What does it look like in professional development and in education? As you consider it in your organizational composition and how your climate very much fosters diversity and community consultation and communication. So if we give you opportunity to explore in terms of what are the many parts of the way that we conduct business in these areas, this is a way that we would operationalize its tenets. Now, as I said earlier, it's important for us to think about how we understand diversity, equity, and inclusion as concepts, as lenses that we can then use as a framework that would then have us integrate DEI in the many parts of the work that you are engaged in. So let me just introduce these concepts in terms of how I present them when I work with different groups on campus. Lots of jargon, but I want to make sure that we have an understanding in terms of what this looks like in practical terms. So when we think about the word inclusion, okay, at the end of the day, it needs to look like something. So it puts the concept of diversity into action. So it needs to be in your policies and practices that embrace the promotion of diversity, equality, and equity. Now, when we think about what this would look like in practice, one example would be we as the University of California engaged in this campaign of making sure that we look at single stall restrooms and converting them into gender inclusive restrooms so that everyone has access to it. That is how we make this concept into a reality. And of course, there are lots of different ways in terms of how we have work towards that end. And the beauty about this is you within your own departments or units can explore in terms of, okay, what are the things that we do that we may be able to tweak if we apply an inclusion lens to it? And what does that look like and how does it change our practice and policy? And then there is this concept related to equity, certainly very different from equality. Both are important, but I'd like for you to think about this in this way. Equality is we want everyone at UC Davis to succeed. Equity is how do we make provisions to make sure that everyone succeeds given the reality of differences. Perhaps some of you may have seen some version of this model before. It is the most common way in terms of how we discern the difference between the two. I like it as a starting point, but it's not actually complete because if you look at where each of those bicycles are traveling on, it's a pretty straight and even path. And we know that's not how things are set up. So it brings into focus the idea of the playing field, because after all, when we think about equity, it is making provisions for the reality of differences in terms of how in each and every single one of us experience different spaces or the structures that we have set up. So let me offer this, and I borrowed this from my colleagues over in human resources. So it really have us explore that model differently. So in this particular one, if you look at the ground where the boxes are on, it's uneven because it speaks to the reality in terms of how structures are actually created. And there are some things that are in place that may perpetuate inequities. So the responsibility for us is how we as an institution respond to the inequities. And I'm just going to read this verbatim because I think it captures it better than I can, to make sure that we have an understanding in terms of what we mean by equity. So imagine, if you will, 3 people all the same size, the ground beneath them slopes buckling beneath one person so significantly that this person cannot see over the fence at all. The foundation on which these people stand is unequal, and that leads to some being able to watch the game while others cannot. The person who is on the slope requires a box or two to stand on, but it is only because they are on lower ground to start, not because they are shorter to begin with. So what I like about this is that it focuses the attention on the institution and our responsibility to address the inequities that are in place. And if we have an opportunity for greater equity in our practices and policies and how we move towards that, or if we have the opportunity to create new practices and policies, how do we make sure that we apply an inclusion and equity lens so that we don't perpetuate gaps? Now, why is this important in our work? And this is my way of introducing the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. Our colleague Whitney has been so kind in making sure that you have a link to a box of a couple of documents that you can take with you, because this will make it easier for you to take it back to your respective units or departments. So Chancellor May back in 2018 and 2017, as part of his To Boldly Go vision, and in particular, it was goal number 3 of his To Boldly Go vision, said implement the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. In the last year and a half, I've been engaged with many units and departments on campus and supporting them in terms of how they implement this, as informed by the work that they do. Now, one of the documents is called Goal Roll-Up, okay? Certainly provides an opportunity for us to understand how the diversity and inclusion strategic vision fits within all of the other initiatives that are that we have on campus, from Chancellor May's To Boldly Go vision, to our move to transitioning to becoming a Hispanic serving institution, and certainly in terms of how my office can play a role in support of the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. Now, the other document that is in that box is a summary of the strategic vision that identifies for you the 5 goals. So here are the 5 goals. Now, the challenge is, how do we think about the work that we do and identify which I would call the low-hanging fruits, or perhaps in the beginning, the win-win, and then see in terms of how it translates or how it feeds into each of these goals. I'll give you an example in terms of what some departments have done or have considered in support of any of these goals. So the very first 2 explores identifying, attracting, and retaining diverse graduate students, faculty, and staff. So all departments have what we would call hiring practices, right? Or admission practices. So if we apply a DEI lens on our practice and policies, how would that change? So what some departments are doing, and certainly this is something that many of you who are faculty are aware of, there's the STED training that requires faculty who are going to be involved in selection committee to make sure that they go through a bias training that very much informs their participation in selection committee. So what some departments are doing now is that if you are going to be a part of a selection committee, it's important for you to have awareness and knowledge in terms of avoiding bias in hiring practices. So that makes it really practical, and we know that we can connect this to these first 2 goals. Now, another example would be in the area of promoting diversity and inclusion in our research, teaching, public service, and training on campus and in neighboring communities. So where my office can be a partner with you is in the area of professional development for faculty, students, and staff. Now, lots of departments now are integrating DEI-related topics as part of everyone's professional development. All of us, I believe, are great technicians in the work that we do. And what we're doing here is we are now making sure that exploration of diversity, equity, and inclusion is also an important part of everyone's professional development. So they have created structures to integrate that as part of, again, just the way that they do business. And it's not to check a box, but really is intended to shift the culture of organizations and departments. So if you take that summary with you and begin to engage your colleagues from your respective departments and units and ask, what are we doing in implementing the diversity and inclusion strategic vision? I imagine that it is the starting point of what I would hope to be a rich discussion that would have you think about what you would do to meet Chancellor May's challenge to implement it. So here are some things to consider moving forward, okay? When you respond to these questions and reflect on them, my idea of offering them to you is to actually ask yourselves, what are the structures that we have created that very much responds to these questions? And I use the word structure intentionally, because when we are able to describe that structure, we can actually think about it within the context of practice and policy. Now, we have a tendency to think that everyone knows in terms of how this operates within our units or departments, and that's not the case. So if you are challenged to actually describe, well, I actually do not know what the structure we have in our offices that very much responds to these, then it means that there's an opportunity for you to build that structure very much in support of the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision and how they correspond to each of those 5 goals. So let me just share this with you. As I said earlier, I believe leadership happens in the world of DEI for everyone, both formally and informally. I like the idea of each and every single one of us exploring in terms of how we can practice these considerations in terms of how we demonstrate our support of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, these are just starting points that you may consider so that you can begin creating, okay, the framework in terms of how you're going to respond to any of those 5 goals that very much support the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. So here are some next steps for you, okay? Now, many units and departments across campus are creating a DEI working group, and essentially the charge of many of these DEI working group is the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. So that becomes the framework, makes it a lot easier. There are a lot of groups that are really, really ahead of the ball game here, and it's okay if you're just starting. Now, I can be of support to you to come to your department and unit to begin the conversation in terms of how you may begin implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. And in terms of how we can be partners to you, I partner with academic affairs in the world of faculty development. So I typically partner with Binny Singh in the area of professional development for faculty. And then we also have lots of events that are coming out of our office that you can certainly support. In particular, know that there are advisory committees to the Chancellor that very much looks at policies and practices that impact all of us as members of the community, from the staff affirmative action group to status of women on campus at UC Davis, to the disability awareness constituency groups. And then the last one that was just approved is looking at our advising practices for all of our students to make sure that they integrate DEI as a lens. And then of course, in the area of professional development, my specific group can certainly support you in this area. It's not uncommon for many departments to invite my team once, twice, or 3 times a year to engage in conversations on a variety of topics related to DEI, again, embedded as just part of you doing business moving forward. Okay, so here are some opportunities for you to begin thinking about how you would support the implementation of the diversity and inclusion strategic vision. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your attention, and thank you again to Team Research for this invitation. There is my email address, and we also have an email address that you can certainly reach out to should you if you are ready to begin integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of your educational opportunities for your respective organization or group. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. That was a wonderful presentation. I hope everyone get an opportunity to reach out and connect with Michael when appropriate. So we're gonna get ready for our next presentation. We have 2 wonderful presenters from the Feminist Research Institute. We have the director, Dr. Kalindi Vora, And we have the Associate Director presenting, Dr. Sarah McCullum, and they're going to give a talk on how a commitment to equity can improve research collaborations. So let's welcome our next presenters.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting us today. I'm Kalindi Vora. I'm director of the Feminist Research Institute and professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies. And I'm here today with Dr. Sarah McCullough, who's the associate director of FREE. And I just wanted to say it's always invigorating to be in a room with people who come together because they're committed to make change happen. So thank you for being here. So Sarah and I are here to share some of the social justice informed tools and approaches that FREE has been providing for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research collaborations here at UC Davis and beyond. And the Feminist Research Institute, for those of you who don't know, was established in 2016 and was founded to help UC Davis become a world leader in feminist scholarship with noted focus on excellence in feminist science studies, feminist science, and global interdisciplinary feminist research. So FREE aims to put UC Davis at the cutting edge of research and awareness building around gender, sexuality, and race equality. Key to this is connecting feminist research from the humanities and social sciences, with STEM programs on both the main campus and health sciences campus. So the result is research that can be responsive to the changing needs of our world, research with a broader reach that illustrates the vital role of the university in the betterment of society. So FREE's work amplifies the broader impact of our research, which then leads to better grant rankings for our PI partners. And our mission supports the principles of community and the goals of UC Davis's strategic plan, particularly around excellence and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So today I'm going to start by briefly talking about some of the specific research tools and practices that we've developed to support collaborative and transdisciplinary research. So Sarah and I are both trained in the social study of science. This is an interdisciplinary field that examines the underlying history, philosophy, and culture informing scientific concepts and practices. So we're also trained in the social science of studying race and gender. So when we go in for grants as PIs, we were already doing research in these areas. And as the leadership of FREE, we realized that to bring this social impact expertise together with that of STEM researchers, we first needed to create common ground through research training programs. So we couldn't just jump into the collaborations. We had to create a foundation to work from with the people that we wanted to collaborate with. So from this project came some of the tools that we want to share with you today. So I'll mention some research training tools and also tools for facilitation of research collaboration. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we know that maximizing the potential of diverse talent has to happen through both the process of doing research, as well as how we choose the research questions we're going to pursue. So based on decades of social science research, we've seen an unrealized potential in empowering women and underrepresented community members to bring their full selves, which, as was mentioned earlier, includes unique expertise and experience to their work. And we like to think of this at FREE as a kind of women in STEM 2.0. So in other words, once we have more underrepresented people here on campus, how do we then maximize that potential? And in fact, this kind of work is what we've heard from a number of underrepresented and women faculty and students. This is the kind of research that they want to do, research with social impact, research that allows them to address issues that impact the people and communities that we claim as a university to be targeting for inclusion. So next slide, please. So just to give you a brief overview of some of the ways that we support, we offer training for researchers and support collaboration. And specifically, we support new kinds of research collaborations that are less hierarchical and therefore more inclusive. and that promote belonging and therefore innovation. So to give you a sense of that, I'm going to go over some of the tools we developed by categories here to connect people who don't usually connect. So as far as graduate students, in addition to the Asking Different Questions research training series, which Sarah is going to focus on, I've also been teaching an annual graduate methods seminar attached to that National Science Foundation supported training program, Asking Different Questions. And that seminar brings in graduate students from across fields, STEM fields, social science, arts and humanities. And in that class, I teach them how to design research projects that are transdisciplinary, and they are tasked with creating a one brief project that creates an intervention in their research area. So some of those projects, some examples have included, one project was an introduction to Native American approaches to science for the field of environmental science. Another project was a workshop for healthcare practitioners to help them do better in transgender healthcare by incorporating groundbreaking discoveries in the biology of sex that have been published by feminist scientists, also together with critiques of the social category of gender from gender studies, together with recent medical research that's been influenced by those discoveries. And then a third example, and these are all projects that not only were developed in theory in the class, but the students are actually doing these right now on our campus. So a third example is one student developed a process guide for developing a feminist lab manual. So in other words, developing a lab manual that would promote less hierarchy and therefore more inclusion in the lab, and that was a pharmacology PhD student. So again, just briefly, in terms of faculty, some examples of how we've supported collaboration include FRI consulting on grant writing. We do this across disciplines. FREE also serves as a subcontracting unit for interdisciplinary proposals. We've often served as a subcontractor for educational and public impact in those areas when people are doing interdisciplinary work. And as another example, every year FREE hosts an annual year-long collaboratory. So this year, and that collaboratory is thematic. So this year our theme is Beyond Health, and it brings together humanists, social scientists, and healthcare and medical practitioners to experiment together with new ways to approach racial justice in healthcare. So that collaboratory serves as a kind of incubator where we can come up with a shared foundation and then start working on grant proposals together. So those are just a few examples of some things that we've done. And now I want to invite Sarah to add some more.
Great. Thank you so much, Kalindi. So a lot of the work that we're doing, I believe, is really creating collaborations that are based in equity, where equity is not simply an add-on to what's already happening, but actually is at the core. And as Kalindi's been sharing, one of the key ways that we do this first is by establishing shared language and a shared commitment. And that is through the Asking Different Questions program, whether it is in the public modules that I've been teaching or the seminar that Kalindi has been teaching. And I'll say more about this in case you're not familiar with the program in just a few minutes. And once people sort of have that shared language and a shared commitment to equity, to justice, to doing projects that maybe have capacity to be solved within a discipline, but many of which do not, then they have the tools to better engage in a collaboratory, a sort of team research, team science sort of framework. And so here we encourage and host groups like the Beyond Health group that Kalindi is talking about, that are open, flexible, that have the capacity to address complex problems. And finally, once we have those teams, then we have solutions that can address the roots of problems, research findings that are interconnected, contextualized, and impactful. And what I really want to emphasize here is how much we've learned that a shared commitment to that is in a sense values-based, that is geared towards a desire to to shift the world towards one that is more based in equity and justice is absolutely foundational to all this. And really the asking different questions is where people get the footing to be able to see that not just as a personal value, but actually as an intellectual commitment as well. So to say a little bit more about asking different questions, this is a program that really provides graduate students, faculty, any who participate with the intellectual foundations to do justice-oriented research. And we're finishing up a series. We'll actually have the last for the spring quarter right after this. And the feedback that we've gotten has been really, really positive. And so we wanted to just share that with you. After attending, 89% of those who attend plan on taking action based on what they learned. So this may be talking with colleagues about it. It may be changing something in the way they teach. It may be shifting their lab manual to be more inclusive. It may even be shifting their research topics and the types of questions they ask. Additionally, 89% recommend these sessions to a colleague. We have a really strong return rate for these sessions. And after the first 2 sessions, we asked people, do you plan to come back? And literally every single person said yes. As you can see from the chart here, 55% of those attending feel that they are underrepresented in their field. And this really is where we see the intersection between justice-oriented research and those who are historically underserved by the disciplines and have been historically excluded. People are bringing in different types of questions and they need different tools to do this. So you might wonder, what kind of topics are we exploring in these trainings? Topics include looking at the roots of issues of belonging in science. Many of us know that a feeling of belonging is absolutely crucial to retention of those that are historically underrepresented. And so we have one training that explores what researchers have had to give up to be a part of the scientific community. What parts of themselves, what parts of their research passions have to be left behind in order to fit in and be accepted. And consequently, what kinds of research impacts are also lost. We also look at questions such as how legacies of colonialism within science are still with us today. We teach the history of science and how it is incredibly enmeshed with the history of colonialism. And we learn how legacies of topics such as eugenics continue to resonate in research structures today. Of course, eugenics is not considered a topic of study, but things that contain some of the assumptions upon which genetics rests do remain and continue to cause unintended harm within research. And so we teach that so people can learn how to undo that. Similarly, we teach people how bias is present in the language, models, and theories of a field. And we're not talking about necessarily implicit bias at the individual level, but we're talking about what that looks like as it's presented in textbooks, in lab reports, in publications. And so literally the language that people are choosing to represent scientific phenomenon may be reinforcing stereotypical biases that are not only damaging to people, but also are limiting how people frame and see the research and thus limiting potential discoveries and breakthroughs. So at the Feminist Research Institute, we really believe that equity is the future of research. It absolutely has to be. And I just put up sort of like 3 areas where we can see this, but we can apply this to virtually any field. One apt area is climate change. Right now, actually right after this, I'll be teaching about the intersection of toxic landscapes, environmental justice, and social inequity, and how these things combine to create health inequities. I'll be featuring, talking more about the research of Claire Cannon in Kettleman City, a faculty member here who's also on the Feminist Research Institute board. And what we can really see is without equity, certain communities are considered expendable. communities like Kettleman City in the Central Valley, communities like coastal indigenous communities whose lands are literally being overtaken by water. And so we, by centering equity within climate science, we get different solutions that are addressing the needs of those made most vulnerable and often are the least at fault. So another example, if we turn to health, is represented in the work of our Beyond Health initiative. And this includes questions such as really thinking about how health innovations can impact those who are most in need. And, you know, in a sense, also questioning like, what good are these health innovations when some people can't even access a hospital? So in a sense, that means also widening what health means. That health means more than just not getting, much more than just, you know, not being sick. It means being able to access overall wellness. We also look at equity in design, thinking about for whom are we designing new technologies, whether it's you know, the latest smartphone or something as simple as a new road design. And thinking about how presenting tools for how we can engage in more collaborative processes. So what can you do? What you'll see here is just kind of like some big takeaways that we are seeing from the work we're doing thus far. One thing is to learn about and address the histories of one's research fields. Virtually all fields do have complicity with historic and ongoing inequity. And the more you know about those, the more capacity you have to make change. We also encourage research units and departments to create structures that support community-based, as in partnering with communities, community-based transdisciplinary research. This means collaborating with communities, social science, humanists, artists, as well as an array of other STEM scholars. This means funding projects that have a foundation in equity, perhaps baking that into grant requirements in a way that hasn't happened before. It also means supporting junior scholars, forging new research paths. We have these absolutely amazing graduate students like Kalindy was talking about, thinking about new ways to do research in their fields. And they're going to need support because as we all know, breaking new ground within a research area is incredibly difficult work and people need all the support they can get. So these are just a few things that we can do. I'm going to pass it over now to Kalindy to close us out here.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm always inspired and re-inspired again, hearing about all the things that our collaborators are doing, even though I know them already. So we just wanted to end on the note of recognizing that the kind of work it takes to do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects often feels risky to people because it feels like you're disinvesting energy from what gets recognized as valuable in your field and you're putting it somewhere else. And we wanted to share the kinds of successes we've had bringing together radically different kinds of researchers who've taken risks because they've succeeded not only in promoting research that moves them and us towards a better world, but also they have been recognized in their fields for the contribution this work makes. So it is possible. And we mostly wanted to just kind of start a conversation with you all today and encourage you to think about how the approaches we've shown to research design, which bring together tools to empower the unique expertise of our diverse thinkers on campus, as well as tools for incorporating change-based values in research leadership, can actually promote people's success both within their disciplines and in changing the disciplines. And so that's kind of where we wanted to pause there and the next steps. We welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kalindy and Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation, lots of great information and exciting to see all that's happening at the Feminist Research Institute. So we're moving forward now with panel discussion and questions from our audience. And so we will have all our speakers be panelists. And this is a time when you can come and ask questions and open for discussions, opportunities, action plans, feedback to the panelists, and to share with the group. Since it's a large group here, we have 71 participants. You can use the raise your hand function that's under the actions with the little emoji con, and you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your question. And you can also put your question in the chat box. So we're open the floor for questions. So we have a question here in the chat box for you, Michael. For Michael, how can we measure and monitor progress towards achieving DEI goals in our units? And this is from Lauren.
That's a really good question, Lauren. So I think as folks think about how they're going to respond to supporting any of the 5 goals, it's important for them to come up with things that they measure. And so this is an easy one. Typically, the question that I get asked in my world of DEI is, if you do this, it leads to this particular result. Or if I attend this training, it's going to lead to behavioral change. When there are a lot of factors that come into play in terms of how we can measure that. So the way that I would ask folks to think about this is, if, for example, they are going to integrate professional development for everyone, then they can come up in terms of the measure in showing success in how they have reached that particular objective. So there is a group on campus that has 600 employees. When they started integrating professional development for everyone as part of professional development, then the way that they measured it is, we have folks who, these are the number of folks who have completed this particular initiative. Same thing in terms of when you think of it as far as how you may tweak your hiring practices. So the way that you would measure outreach in your hiring practices would be, in the past, what we have done is just sort of passively posted vacancies. As part of how we respond to the call of the strategic vision and applying DEI lens, this is the different ways now we have done our outreach. And that's the way that we have measured our success in this area. So instead of just passively posting, then we do these very, very specific outreach to listserv groups, to organizations surrounding the university, how we have used the census to make sure that we have an understanding of the availability of folks in this particular field. So those are what I would call the measurements.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Rebecca. This one says, do you have information about historic inequality in research at UC Davis that you are trying to address? So I guess that could be for all panelists.
I can say a bit about that. And so one of the most basic ways that one of the most basic historic inequities of being a land-grant institution is that this university was built based on the taking lands from Indigenous peoples. And so the first thing we can think about is how we can work to rebuild and repair relationships with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous scholars who are working in the sciences in our universities, and seeing and working to revalue their knowledges. So that's one example. More broadly, different types of knowledges, such as Indigenous sciences, have been historically devalued and told that they're sort of not, quote unquote, like real science and, worthy of support and funding. So that's another example. As I mentioned, the history of eugenics continues to resonate within virtually all fields. I don't think many people realize how common it was, 100 years ago in our fields. And 100 years ago was also when many fields were creating their foundations. Last week, I talked about the foundations of computer science based in surveillance and militarization. And as we now know and recognize that who gets surveilled is not something that all communities share equally. Many Black communities and communities of color are over surveilled. And so these are all ways that that current historic and ongoing research at UC Davis may be unwittingly complicit in perpetuating inequities. Kalindi or Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Sure, a few things to consider in terms of my world, which is in education. One of the topics that we consistently explore is the achievement rates between groups, and especially for our undergrads, and also how this translates in terms of access to opportunities beyond undergraduate. So when you look at the what we would call the pipeline, it shrinks. The diversity shrinks when you go from undergrad to graduate level, and that's in many different disciplines. So there's ongoing research in terms of how we mitigate that. As far as achievement rates, and especially at the undergraduate level, it provides an opportunity for us to explore the services that we have at the institution that very much responds to the needs of particular groups, and especially underserved groups, because there are assumptions that we make in terms of their preparation when they come from high school to the university. And part of that also is the role of SATs as an eligibility requirement, for example, in Access to University of California. Lots of research in terms of disparate impact across racial and ethnic lines. And when we think about in the world of staff, in the world of faculty, employees, one of the things that we like to have an understanding is equity in terms of pay across different classifications, and also exploring in terms of the movement, for example, for some of you, from assistant professor to associate professor, how does that play out along gender lines and racial lines? It gives us data points to understand and to look at in terms of what are the structures that we have in place that may actually perpetuate ongoing disparities. So those are some ways that we can certainly address research in this area.
There's also the element of course, who is doing the research and who is leading the research. And these are two different things, I think. So I think there's been good progress in terms of diversifying faculty recruitment, but what happens after you're recruited is not, a homogenous progression of careers, let's just say. So we've been trying to think through, if we were to develop, for example, an emerging research leaders academy with our colleagues in DEI and academic affairs, what would it look like, and how could we accelerate the potential that's clearly there in people to take on more prominent leadership roles directing research centers and institutes. So that's still very much a work in progress, I would say. On the positive movement side, on that front, we can see a number, particularly of the federal research funding agencies in this space, putting in incentives, not just an expectation of having diversity statements in proposals, but going way beyond that and encouraging further evidence of diversities in teams when center scale proposals, for example, are being put together. The people that are actually on the team are already either led by or certainly have leadership from different backgrounds. So I think there's a lot more to be done there actually in that area.
And I'll actually build on what Paul just said. So as many of you know, the UC Davis campus had an NSF Advance grant, and through that collected quite a lot of data on the recruitment of faculty from underrepresented minority categories and on the recruitment of women. And through the program saw an improvement in those rates. At the same time, that project was aware of data on campus that showed that, as Paul mentioned, the retention of faculty, particularly in those groups, has not been improving. And that data hasn't been made public yet, as far as I know, but we should check with the Advance Office. What was interesting about that data on post-tenure researchers was that the ways that their research was being impeded weren't clear and transparent. They were happening in what might be understood to be inadvertent ways in which bias often operates. So the size of the lab, the time from which you requested equipment until it got set up, all these things that are essential for keeping a timely schedule for research productivity. And we've also heard, FREE has also heard through a group we've been running this year called Crafting Equitable Research Cultures, which brings together faculty from across campus to, we're producing a document to inform campus leadership on how faculty feel equity can be addressed. And what's been coming up in that group also is the ways that structurally a lot of the work that is trying to change campus climate and structures is not recognized by departments or disciplines as equally valuable to other kinds of research productivity. So I can give specific examples in certain fields, but we all know that mentorship falls unequally based on the categories we represent in society, right? So if we represent underrepresented folks on campus, we are sought out to help those people through the structure and so forth. And so a lot of this kind of service work also doesn't get valued as highly by in our reviews. And so these are things, you know, in our small group breakout, we were talking about what are things that we can do as research leaders on campus to improve our processes within our departments or our labs. And these are just a few examples that have come up from that data, just to answer Rebecca Linville's question.
Great, thank you. That was some good feedback there. Our next question in the chat box, probably Michael can answer this one. Do you think affirmative action helps or hurts the diversity movement?
So there is a scholar in School of Ed that very much studies this, and her name is Nicole Kurlander, who was also my advisor when I was a graduate student in Davis. So let me just speak to affirmative action as a federal policy, and there's still a lot of misunderstanding in terms of what affirmative action is. As a federal policy that comes as part of the Civil Rights Act, it is still something that we have to abide by because we receive federal monies. Now, how does this factor in our hiring practices, in our admissions processes? Know that we have something called Proposition 209. Okay, and Proposition 209 is what some may call the antithesis to the affirmative action. And whether you believe in affirmative action or not, or its value, we have to recognize it is still a federal mandate that we have to abide by. Proposition 209 has revealed that there has been a decline in terms of recruitment, or at least admission, especially of underrepresented students at many of the UC campuses. And in particular, those who are traditionally underrepresented, Native American students, African American students, and Latinx and Chicanx students. So when we think about Proposition 209 and how that comports with the mandates of affirmative action, where we certainly can play a role in looking at our practices and policies is in our outreach for both filling vacancies, okay, and job opportunities, and also what it means for us to respond to the eligibility requirements, and very much as part of holistic review in the admissions process. We know that Proposition 209 says that we cannot use race and gender as criteria in admission and hiring practices. But where we can make some meaningful dents here is how to ensure that our applicant pool will be robust. So what does recruitment practices look like? What do outreach practices look like? So that is a way for us to respond to the mandates of affirmative action, given the confines of Proposition 209. And of course, all of us are paying attention with the current makeup of the Supreme Court on what happens to affirmative action, because it will likely, again, go back to the Supreme Court to decide if it is a constitutional mandate or not.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. So this next question we can have for Kaladi. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. So this question is, what would your advice be to junior researchers who want to bring awareness and make changes, but are not sure how to break ground in their discipline?
I love this question, and I'm going to try to be as concise as possible and also invite Sarah, because Sarah's spoken to many PhD researchers as well. So there are several ways to approach this. One is at the level of mentorship. I think that having mentors be educated on the possibilities to do interdisciplinary research, to structure research design in partnership with other stakeholders besides your lab or your discipline, is essential. I was very excited to hear from Paul that the Office of Research is considering this Research Leadership Academy, because that can be one of the, I think that's a skill that a lot of mentors wish they had, to be able to guide students in this way. Another piece of advice that that FREE can pass along is that building a community, even if, for example, a PhD student in a lab doesn't have a lot of leeway in terms of choosing their research question, building a community around their social change commitments that can help support their thinking and their network building as they proceed through that PhD study is essential. And we've found that actually empowers PhD students and junior researchers to find resources to help educate their peers, their labs, and even their supervisors in the intellectual benefit of bringing together social change commitments and research commitments. So sometimes this is an educational project, and it is more work for a junior researcher, but it often allows them to bring more innovative questions into their work and to be more satisfied and to make it through the so-called pipeline farther, which is what Sarah and I were trying to get across in our presentation today. And the third thing I would say is that my PhD students start out nervous and afraid to take risks, and by the end of just 10 weeks, have figured it out. And they figure it out in many different ways, and they become inspirations for others. So that's why I said today that the kind of main goal of our presentation was to encourage people to reach out and find ways to do this. Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think in a way I'm just echoing what you've shared. Overall, I encourage people to think about how to build networks of solidarity, because if you're trying to make some change in your discipline, especially as a junior researcher, you will meet resistance. And so it's incredibly important to build your allies and think strategically with your allies. Find people who are in those more senior positions who can mentor you and can help you to think about how and when to make the interventions, because they're someone who knows the dynamics of the department or of your conference, your field, whatever it is. That's absolutely invaluable. So yeah, build networks, know who your allies are, and work with them, and know that they're always there for you.
In the world of research centers and institutes that sort of already have some level of structure, we've been strongly encouraging our faculty leaders and directors to be as inclusive as possible when building strategic plans. So I think that's quite empowering when you have everyone involved in setting the direction of the organization that you're in directly. So trying to be as inclusive as possible. And I think with junior researchers and others, that's a great venue to have an opportunity to try and bring alternative approaches and different knowledge to the table as you're building something. So that's just a small thing that we've been suggesting and trying to encourage recently.
And if I may just add, I think every single one of you have the opportunity to inquire with leadership from your departments to say, what are we doing about the diversity and inclusion strategic vision? Do we have an opportunity to create this working group? I'd like to be part of it. The beauty about that is you get to inform in terms of the direction, in terms of how you respond as a department, as an organization, in really exploring the different ways and how you support the different goals. There are many names in here that I recognize that certainly have been leaders in this regard. And I am a firm believer and a big fan of looking for your allies. There are lots of champions in all of the corners of your organizations and departments that you can certainly build coalition on how to make sure that you look at opportunities to integrate DEI in the many parts of the work that your departments or your organizations are engaged in.
Great, thank you for answering all the questions from our participants in the audience. As we're moving towards closing, would the panelists like just to give a few sentences of some closing remarks for our audience here? We could start in order of presentation and start with Paul.
Okay, well, I thought that was a really engaging discussion today. It's the kind of discussion that makes me proud to work at UC Davis, actually, and for people to clearly be so passionate and interested in trying to create a more equitable and equal society. And I do think there's a special role that universities have to play in leading in this regard. I think historically universities have been great change agents for many different injustices and challenges in societies. They haven't been immune, of course, from being involved in some on a negative sense, but there has been, I think, many great examples of how universities can be change agents. And I think this is an area where there's a lot of passion, a lot of interest, and a lot of capability. So I think it's great that the way things have been flowing down as well in terms of the overall campus strategic plan, coming right down to the individual levels for staff members in our annual appraisals, being asked what have we actually done. So I think that's a very positive move as well. So that's what I have to say.
And for me, just to keep it short, you do not have to do this alone. You have colleagues across campus who can support you in doing this. No one is expecting for a complete systems overhaul. It's called a system for a reason. It will be here long after our time at the university, but I do believe that we all make meaningful dents. I mean, if I can only speak for myself in terms of my experience being a product of the University of California, there are things that we have done that certainly supported someone of my background and of my needs in terms of being a member of marginalized groups. And what it means is we have made strides. Are we going to be perfect? This? Absolutely not. But I do think that we can identify opportunities in terms of how we make those meaningful tweaks to change in terms of how we operate, again, to move us closer to being more just. I am a resource to you. If I'm not the appropriate person, I will do my best to identify a better resource in terms of your search and supporting your DEI efforts.
And I'll just add that I think that the growing interest and proven success of team research and convergence research approaches is an invitation for us to think about this opportunity to increase inclusion through the kinds of research questions we can ask, and also through the kinds of research processes we design. And it seems like these are really successful approaches, and they're only going to grow. And so that for us means, you know, an opportunity that's only going to grow as well.
And the last thing I would add is that I have so much hope for this work because we are learners. We're researchers. We're constantly discovering new knowledge, and we're really good at it. And this is what this to me is part of that mission. This part is to continue our learning, continue seeking new knowledge, finding ways to refine the work we do. And so it's completely in line with the things that as researchers we are incredibly good at, which means I think that we can make a lot of progress in this area. So a lot of hope.
Thank you to all our panelists, and we're going to have Ana Lucia close us out with next steps. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. I know this session was about 30 minutes longer than we usually do, but the discussion was wonderful, and I think all of us are going back to our rest of our day and our weekend with at least a few things to think about and ponder how we can contribute to the DEI strategic plan and just making our university more inclusive and more equitable. Our next session for our team research forum is June 11th. We are going to have a session focused on aging in research and animal models. For those of you who are interested in that, I'm going to be sharing that through the multiple email distribution lists. Our plan at Office of Research for our team is to continue working with Michael's group, with Kalindi's group, with Sarah, and with other people on campus on DEI, and see what else we can do in terms of bringing you content, actionable information on how you can continue to build on your skill set and incorporate some of these DEI elements into your team research and as you start thinking about your research program. So we would love to hear from you. If there's something that particularly resonated with you today and you would like us to work on expanding that, we are happy to work with you and put that together. And with that, we wish everyone a great and very safe long weekend. It's going to be very hot. Drink lots of water. Stay away from fire, and have a great weekend.